Thanks very much for the invitation to come and talk to you today. My name is John Garry. I work in Queen's University in Belfast. I come from County Mayo, and so given that I'm a Mayo man in Dublin, I should begin by congratulating all the Dubliners in the audience on their incredibly lucky and incredibly narrow victory over a fantastic Mayo team in the recent match. And I'm sure all the Mayo diaspora internationally looking at this will share in those hearty congratulations of Dublin. I'm here to address the following question. This was my remit when I talked to the people organising this. The key question is, if people living in Northern Ireland were allowed to vote in an Irish presidential election, what on earth would happen? It's a counterfactual, it's a hypothetical. What impact would it have on an Irish presidential election if a quite radical step was taken and you allow people living in Northern Ireland to actually vote in it? Quite apart from being great fun and highly entertaining and very unusual, what would actually happen? And in order to systematically try to get a handle on this, like a lot of the other talks you've heard today, I'm going to rely on some evidence from a systematic and representative survey that I was involved in organising and commissioning in Northern Ireland in 2009. And it was a slightly odd series of questions that I asked in 2009 because I had no idea that this very relevant question would be brought up in this convention a few years later. And I wanted to ask a set of questions of Northern Ireland citizens, stroke people who live in Northern Ireland. I know the term citizens is going to be a bit contested here today, but I asked a representative sample of people in Northern Ireland how they were disposed electorally towards a range of political parties. Not only those political parties that organise and compete in Northern Ireland elections, but also political parties from the Republic of Ireland. And essentially wanted to ask people a hypothetical question. When you're faced with a range of possible political parties, how likely is it that you would ever vote for these parties? What's your general disposition? And the wording of the questions is quite crucial here because it's a slightly unusual wording, albeit a wording that's been used in many international studies of how citizens regard political parties. It's a different question from who did you vote for? This is a question which is designed to tap into people's underlying feelings towards political parties. And so the precise wording is, we have a number of political parties in Northern Ireland, each of which would like to get your vote. How likely is it that you would ever vote for the following parties? Please use this scale to indicate your views, where 1 means not at all likely and 10 means very likely. So instead of asking people, did you vote for party X or Y? Would you vote for party X or Y? We want to get the nuance and the variation amongst the population in terms of their disposition. So people could say 1, I would never vote for this party, or 10, I would definitely vote for this party. Or more usually, they would give a number somewhere in between. And in turn, each of the main Northern Ireland parties were asked, the Alliance Democratic Unionist Party, SDLP, Sinn Féin and Ulster Unionist Party. It's the responses to the Sinn Féin question that I'm particularly interested in today because of those parties, Sinn Féin is the party most likely to either nominate or support a candidate in an Irish presidential election. Northern Ireland respondents to the same survey were also asked the following question. There are a number of political parties in the Republic of Ireland who may at some stage run candidates in a Northern Ireland election. If the following parties took part in a Northern Ireland election, how likely is it that you would ever vote for this party? Please use this scale to indicate your views, where 1 means I would never vote for this party, 10 means I would definitely vote for this party. This is quite a difficult question for people to answer because it's very much a counterfactual, it's a hypothetical question. You're hitting them with a slightly odd one. And so, and this is illustrated in the sense that when I was commissioning the survey and talking to the market research company, they wanted to give directions to the people doing the interviews which phonetically spelled out the pronunciation of Irish political parties. So we had to put in Fianna Fáil is Fi Anna Fáil, Fine Gael is Fine Gael, because the don't know responses would be even higher if we let people loose with these words. And that's the big difference between doing surveys in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland asking about these parties. So, to simplify matters, when people responded on a 1 to 10 scale to each of these questions, I simplified matters by recategorizing them as follows. If people gave an answer of 1 to a particular party, that meant they would never vote for the party. If they gave a response between 2 and 5, that's fairly negative, and anywhere between 6 and 10 I interpret as being fairly positively disposed towards the party. And I kept a don't know category because that's very important in these hypothetical counterfactual type analyses. These are the basic results, but before you look at the numbers, I'll enter one caveat in that I'm not reporting the percentages of all Northern Ireland respondents, because if there was the ability for people who live in Northern Ireland to vote in an Irish presidential election, nobody believes that all of the people in Northern Ireland would vote. Even in the Assembly elections in Northern Ireland, there is an unfortunately quite dramatic decline, and in what would almost certainly be an even less important election, an Irish presidential election, important and all as that might be, you wouldn't get a large majority of Northern Ireland people voting. So I limited this analysis to people who would be most likely to actually vote. And I defined that in terms of Northern Ireland respondents who did actually vote in the 2009 European Parliament election. My thinking was, if you turn out for that, you turn out for anything, really. Each of these columns in the table shows the responses to those questions broken down into the 4 categories. Let's look at the Sinn Féin responses first. And the thing I've got a red dotty rectangle thing around is the percentage of don't knows. Pretty much everyone in Northern Ireland has an opinion about Sinn Féin. Only 1% of respondents said, I don't know, when you asked them about Sinn Féin. And I think the figure to hone in on here is the 29.3%, these are basically 30% of Northern Ireland respondents tick somewhere between 6 and 10 on the 1 to 10 scale for Sinn Féin. So about 30% of people in Northern Ireland have a generally positive disposition towards possibly voting for Sinn Féin. And the interesting comparison there is with the 3 Republic of Ireland parties. If we think of an Irish presidential election in which there would be candidates either nominated or supported by these 4 parties, and we thought, what on earth would happen with the people in Northern Ireland? Who would they vote for? Well, the support for Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, by this measure, is over 3 times greater than the support for either Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael or Labour, all 3 of whom attract between about 8 and 10% of people in Northern Ireland who are generally positively disposed towards these 3 parties. So Sinn Féin would do quite well. There's a lot of talk being had today about divvying up people in terms of who exactly would we give the right to vote for, just citizens, people who hold particular passports or whatever. If we divide up the sample by Protestant background and Catholic background, we see that Protestants, unsurprisingly, hardly any of them give a positive verdict on Sinn Féin, although it is nearly 3%. But interesting, that's exactly the same, pretty much, as the percentage of Protestants who would give a positive response to any of these 3 parties. So Protestants don't like Sinn Féin, but they don't like Sinn Féin equally as much as they don't like any of the others. So infer what you will. If we just look at Catholics, there's a massive difference in terms of the proportion of people in Northern Ireland who are Catholics who would give a generally positive disposition electorally to Sinn Féin. 2/3 of Catholics would say they would be likely to support Sinn Féin. And that's interesting because For the other three parties, which one might expect to have a decent amount of support amongst the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, the other three parties just get between 15 and 20%. So Sinn Féin is over 3 times, 4 times higher than the possible level of support, hypothetically, that they could attract. One other thing I did to try to investigate Catholic support for these 4 parties a little bit further was to break down Catholics in Northern Ireland between Sinn Féin Catholics and SDLP Catholics. And I particularly hone in on those people's responses to the question about the Irish Labour Party and about Sinn Féin. Now, unsurprisingly, Sinn Féin voters like Sinn Féin. That's a circular tautological argument. It should really be 100%. I know some of them obviously got very disappointed once they'd voted for Sinn Féin for some reason. But the interesting thing is that Sinn Féin voters give a remarkably low level of potential support for the Irish Labour Party. And that's interesting in the sense that if you look at SDLP supporters and you ask them what do they feel about Irish Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, and just look at Sinn Féin and Labour, you see that SDLP voters are essentially open to competition between a Sinn Féin presidential candidate and an Irish Labour Party presidential candidate. SDLP voters are evenly split between Sinn Féin and Labour, and that's quite a strong relationship, really. One other point that I don't have data on, but I know it's true because I examined it, is there's been a lot of talk about how the manner in which you might extend the rights to people outside of the state. Do you hone in on whether someone has a passport or not? Or you define them as a citizen? Those terms puzzle me a little bit. But if you were to define it in terms of some conception of identity, if citizenship means something to do with identity to you, and you break down this data by what Northern Ireland people's sense of national identity is, it does have interesting implications, because despite the fact that we typically dichotomise or see as black and white Northern Ireland politics, Catholics or Irish, Protestants or British, there is a significant emerging third way identity called the Northern Irish identity, which, depending on which survey you look at, attracts a non-trivial amount of respondents. In the surveys I look at, between about 20 and 25% of Catholics say that they're Northern Irish. They're not Irish, they're Northern Irish. It's the same with Protestants. They're not British, they're Northern Irish. And the Northern Irish Catholics are also the SDLP Catholics, who would be the Irish Labour Party Catholics. So it matters an awful lot whether you think of citizenship in terms of some conception of identity. And if so, you wouldn't want to necessarily think that Catholics in Northern Ireland are necessarily Irish. Significant portion aren't. Well, or are. I know it's a hugely contested debate, but they're Northern Irish, which may or may not mean the same thing as Irish. It actually doesn't. On the British side, if you're a Protestant, being British or being Northern Irish is essentially the same thing. It's very hard to disentangle attitudinal, behavioural distinctions between those two bodies of people. In terms of the Catholics in Northern Ireland, it is. A Northern Irish Catholic is different from an Irish Catholic in terms of their attitudes to a united Ireland and in terms of their political behaviour, i.e. their propensity to vote for SDLP rather than Sinn Féin. So, I'm sure I'm out of time, am I? Sorry. Anyway, that's at 60 seconds and I'll stop. I suppose the overall spiel would be Sinn Féin are likely to do well if the vote is extended. Protestants are equally unimpressed with Sinn Féin and the Irish parties. Sinn Féin would do unsurprisingly well amongst Catholics, even more unsurprisingly amongst Sinn Féin supporters, and SDLP supporters would be equally supportive of a Labour Party candidate, probably, and a Sinn Féin candidate. There's some caveats and limitations. Thankfully, I'm out of time, so I don't have to talk about what's wrong with all of this. But it is data from 2009, which you might argue is dated. I don't think it is, to be honest, because these measures are underlying dispositions rather than snapshot who would you vote for. So I think they're more robust to time spans. I didn't directly ask about a presidential election, but if anyone wants to give me £4,000 or £5,000, I will. And there's a whole notion of differential turnout levels. But anyway, that's me. Thank you very much for your attention.